Indian mythology brings us colorful and interesting stories, not only of gods and goddesses, demigods, heroes, kings, but also of certain anti heroes and negative characters, who also had an equally important role to play in the tale. Just as light cannot exist without darkness, so also good cannot exist without evil. What is more, the so called evil and the wicked characters not only release their own karma, but also helped bring good to the world in general. Such is the story of Surpanakha, a demoness by birth. Hers was a persona which could strike terror in the minds of laymen. Yet, there was another side to her that was far softer and more mellow than anyone could imagine. Surpanakha, also spelled as Surpanakha, literally means the one with sharp fingernails, or the one whose fingernails are as long as winnowing fans. She was an important character in the Valmiki Ramayana. Surpanakha was the sister of the main antagonist Ravana. She was the youngest child of sage Vishravas and Kaikeyi. At birth, Surpanakha was given the name of Minakshi. Some also called her Chandranakha, the one with nails like the moon. She was as striking and stately as her mother Kaikeyi and her grandmother Ketumati. When she came of age, she secretly married the Danava prince Vidyutjava. Ravana was enraged that she married a Danava. The Danavas were arch enemies of the Rakshasas. He was about to punish her, but his wife Mandodari convinced him to respect the wishes of his only sister. Thus, Ravana was forced to accept him into the family. After Ravana conquered the underworld, he decided to visit his newly married sister. That is when he discovered Vidyutjava's true motives of marrying Surpanakha. He intended to kill Ravana and get his throne. The latter then attacked and killed him. When Surpanakha came to know of her husband's death and that Ravana had caused it, she was filled with grief. And she then decided to somehow avenge her husband's death, as he was the love of her life. Unable to bear the grief, she split her time between Lanka and the southern forests, where she also spent time with her son called Shambri, who was later accidentally killed by Lakshmana. One such story, written by Valmiki Ramayana, narrates that Surpanakha, while wandering in the forest, met Rama, the exiled prince of Ayodhya. He used to live in the forest of Panchavati along with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana. Surpanakha was instantly smitten by this handsome persona and youthful good looks. She tried to make advances towards Rama, but he repeatedly kept rejecting them. He even told that he had taken a vow of having only one wife, that is Ekapatni Vrata, and hence he would never accept any other woman in his life. This was just to make sure that Surpanakha left him by hook or crook. Surpanakha then approached his younger brother Lakshmana. He reacted very violently. He was very harsh and cruel in his rejection of her and said that she would never become what he desired in a wife. Eventually, she realized that both the brothers were making fun of her. Insulted and humiliated, she attacked Sita, but was thwarted by Lakshmana. When he had had too much, he cut off her nose and her left ear and sent her back to Lanka. Crying loudly, Shurpanakha first went to her brother Khara. He immediately sent Rakshasa warriors to attack Rama. Rama, however, effortlessly defeated them and sent them back. Khara then challenged Rama himself along with many soldiers. They were all killed except for Akampana, Kaikeyi's brother, and then he fled to Lanka. Surpanakha then went to Ravana's court and related the entire story, wailing loudly. She also convinced him to abduct and wed Sita in order to take revenge on Rama and Lakshmana. Akampa too played a vital role in instigating Rama to abduct Sita and make her his own. Many other stories narrate that Ravana was actually smitten by Sita's beauty and wanted her for himself. However, here the only one who was against this was Vibhishana, Ravana's other brother. Ravana called him a traitor and, ignoring his warnings, proceeded to take Sita as a revenge to fulfill his sister's desire. Ravana then abducts Sita. Also, his act of killing Jatayu, the divine vulture, triggered the war between Rama and Ravana. After many days of battle, Ravana was killed at the hands of Rama. As per some legends, Sita and Surpanakha eventually forgave each other after the war and even managed to become friends. The Valmiki Ramayana does not speak of Surpanakha after the war. However, it is generally believed that she continued to live in Lanka after Vibhishana ascended the throne as the king of Lanka. It is said that a few years later she and her half sister Kumbhini perished at sea. Some versions of the Ramayana state that Surpanakha had no real romantic interests in either Rama or Lakshmana. She was still seething about the fact that Ravana had killed her husband and so instigated him, knowing well that he would fight against Rama and eventually be killed at his hands. Rama had killed both her grandmother and terrible Tataka and her uncle Subhanu. She was aware that Ravana would be no match for Rama, and so she patiently plotted for months together and hatched a plan to get him killed. Some even say that without her, the Ramayana war between Rama and Ravana wouldn't have happened. Surpanakha was indeed one of the central characters of the Ramayana. Valmiki himself stated that had there been no Kaikeyi and no Surpanakha, the Ramayana would not have existed. She was the catalyst who set into motion the chain of events that led to the destruction of Ravana. She, therefore, is considered to be the driving force behind the Rama Ravana war. However, there are many other side stories to this. Several scholars state that Surpanakha was in fact a wronged woman. Had Rama and Lakshmana calmly responded with her and reasoned with her, she would have probably understood their point of view and would even have decided to leave the matter alone. But their act of insulting her and humiliating her and severing the parts of her ear and nose were unforgivable, especially for Kshatriyas of their stature. She was a very strong willed, independent woman who dared to approach a man and tell him that she liked him. That should actually be looked as a virtue and is not something to be made fun of. So, why did she want Ravana to get killed so desperately? Apart from the fact that Ravana killed her husband, Surpanakha always felt that she was living under the shadow of her highly dominating brother Ravana. It was like she was never allowed to have a mind of her own. He would order her to do something, and she simply had to do it. Over the years, this created a deep resentment towards him. Though, from Ravana's point of view, he deeply loved his sister and cared too much for her well being. But he also tried to interfere and stop her even when she wished to marry Vidyuchava, the love of her life. It was only because of Mandodari's recommendation that she could finally marry him. Ravana's slaying of her husband was the last straw for her. She was seething with rage when she came to know how Vidyuchava died. She desperately wanted revenge, but being a helpless widow, she could do nothing on her own. So she felt lonely and disrespected in Lanka. And that is why she often spent time away from the palace in the forest, where she found more peace. She was also well aware that no ordinary mortal or beast could cause even the slightest harm to Ravana. It would need someone extraordinary and divine to destroy him. Knowing all these things very well, she knew that only Rama could do this. So she plotted to instigate Ravana against Rama. According to the Uttara Ramayana, after Rama's Pattabhishekam, some people in Ayodhya were still doubting Sita's purity and were wondering who the father of her child could be. Rama heard them discussing the matter and decided that it was in his kingdom's best interest to let Sita go from there, so that no one would doubt his integrity and adhere to his duty as a king. However, he did not have the courage to face Sita and tell her that she would leave the palace. Hence, he asked a reluctant Lakshmana to accompany her till the forest and then abandon her there. As Sita was sitting under a berry tree with immense grief, she found Surpanakha there, filled with hatred, and was gloating and laughing at her. She said that they rejected Sita just as they rejected her. Now Sita was stripped of her status, just as Surpanakha was stripped of her beauty. Though deeply hurt by the Rakshasi's word, Sita found strength to smile at her and offer her the berries. She told Surpanakha that the berries were sweet, as sweet as the ones in Mandodari's garden, and urged her to have some. Sita's gentleness surprised Surpanakha. She had hoped to inflict pain on the former, but she was obviously growing beyond the pain. Finally, she realized that she had to stop this cycle of hatred and had to start loving herself before expecting anyone to love her in return. That was the only way that she could find peace within herself. The tale of Surpanakha has a hidden meaning that all of us can learn from. Her character shows that nothing and no one is absolutely good or bad as we define things from our limited experience of life. Rather, everything and everyone has shades of grey that we must learn to accept. Looking at her story from a different angle and being empathetic towards her, one would probably discover that Surpanakha was not at all that terrible as she was projected to be. There was probably one side of her that was helpless, hapless, downtrodden, and frustrated. She too probably was the victim of circumstances.